Welcome to Home Time. I'm Joanne Liebler.
And I'm Dean Johnson.
We're going to be paying a lot of attention today to one of our home's most neglected surfaces, the ceiling.
We have as much ceiling space as we have floor space, yet we tend to spend all of our time fixing, changing, and arranging those areas that are eye level or lower.
If you're like us, you probably let your ceilings go. Well, maybe they're just stained or cracked, or maybe they're falling down on you.
We'll show you how to handle all sorts of ceiling problems, and we'll show you how to simplify some jobs that seem really tough.
For example, we'll show you how to fill the growing canyons in plaster ceilings, and how to cover with drywall those ceilings that are beyond repair.
And we'll explain ways to dress up your ceilings too, with applications that you might have thought only experts could handle.
Then we'll show you how to install ceiling tiles and suspended ceilings.
Home Time is made possible by Chevy Truck, who brings you tough, full-size Chevy pickups for professionals and do-it-yourselfers like you. Chevy S10 pickups, compact, fun, and hard-working. Chevy S10 Blazer, logic and laughter in 2- or 4-wheel drive. Chevy Astro, the van that can. The heartbeat of America, today's Chevy Truck.
This video is just one in a library of instructional programs designed to assist the viewer in working on a wide range of home improvement projects. And before we begin our program, I want to explain how you can best make use of this educational system. First off, you should watch the tape all the way through to get an idea of the methods, the steps, and the terminology we use. To help familiarize yourself with the terms, we've included a glossary in the project guide. Then you should review the tape again, only this time, check with your project guide to determine the tools and materials appropriate to your project. Then take the project guide to your local building supply dealer or home center. The people there will be able to assist you, answer questions, and direct you to what you need.
Here are some of the tools you'll need for the ceiling projects on this tape. Finishing knives of 6, 10, and 12 inches, a mud pan, a pole sander and paper, particle masks and safety glasses, a tape measure, a chalk line, screw guns, a keyhole saw, hammers, utility knives, metal snips, and a square nose pliers.
If you live in an older home, you probably see an aging layer of plaster when you look at the ceiling. Plaster was the most common surface used for many years.
However, what's above it might be a mystery. So let's take a look at the structure of a ceiling before tackling any repairs or improvements.
The support for the ceiling surface comes from the ceiling joists, boards laid on edge between the walls at 16-inch intervals. Strips of wood called laths are nailed across the joists about 1/4 inch apart. Then 3 layers of plaster go on the wood lath. First a scratch coat, then a brown coat, and finally a finish coat. In newer construction, you'll seldom see lath and plaster. That's because drywall replaced plaster is the most common ceiling material. With drywall, you're able to screw or nail directly into the joists.
The ease of drywall means that the honeymoon is pretty much over for plaster.
Maybe your ceiling isn't exactly falling down on top of you, but up here in the office, we have some good examples of common plaster problems. Cracks that vary in width from hairline to what seem like gouges.
Or maybe there's been an accident that's left a hole like this in your ceiling. We'll show you solutions for each of these plaster problems, starting with the easiest, fixing a hairline crack in the ceiling.
All right, let's start by moving out some furniture. We can cover up the walls with plastic and then get tools and materials.
Okay. You can easily make a small crack disappear using joint compound. These come ready mixed in small containers or in powders that you can mix yourself. And for this crack that we've got right here, the ready mix will work just fine. The quickest method is to smear the compound in small amounts along the crack. When the compound is dry, you can sand it lightly if you need to, and then just touch it up with paint to match the ceiling.
To fix a larger crack, first make sure the plaster around the crack is sound. Probe it with a sharp tool, removing all the loose material. The pros say a can opener works just fine. You want the filler to have a good foothold, so undercut the edges of the crack and make a ledge for the compound to seep under. Our ceiling here has a lot of cracks, so we're gouging them all out down to the sound plaster.
Repairing a hole begins with the same first step. You need to gouge out the damaged plaster around it and get down to a firm area. Sealing cracks can be like the proverbial tip of the iceberg. There may be a lot more damage under the surface than you think. Well, that's what we found, so it took longer than we thought.
When you're working with a lot of larger cracks, you have a variety of joint compounds to choose from. We're working with a special type of powder joint compound.
Okay, let's see how that does.
Mix that up a little bit. Oh yeah, I could definitely use some more. Okay.
There you go, that ought to do that.
It has a chemical catalyst that helps it dry very quickly. You just add water and stir it to the consistency of warm butter. You can run a half-inch drill and paddle to make the job easier. Some mixes will dry in just a few minutes, others in a few hours. For cracks, a 45-minute set is good for applying several coats in one day. Just don't mix up more than you can use in the time it takes to dry.
When the material's ready, moisten the cracks with water. Then you can put up the joint compound, which is known on the job as mud. It's easiest to carry it in a mud pan. Then use a 6-inch taping knife to cover each gap, spreading it smoothly over the surface. Make sure you press it down to fill under the edge, and scrape away any excess. Give any holes a first layer of the mud as well, but not too thick since you don't want it oozing down. If you use the quick dry compound and you've got a lot of cracks, try to work fairly quickly and efficiently.
When you're done with the first coat, go ahead and let it dry. And it's a good idea to wash out all your tools and water in between coats.
Okay.
Once all the mud dries, we can put up this fiberglass reinforcing tape. It makes the whole job a lot stronger.
The tape is porous and it's self-adhesive, so it sticks when you press it to the areas of repair. You then embed it with more mud, spreading a thin coat with a 6-inch taping knife. Feather the edges out to blend in with the rest of the ceiling. You can also use the tape over the hairline cracks before putting any mud down. Just stick the tape on, then cover it with mud with a taping knife.
Let the first layer dry thoroughly before starting the second. First, use a 10-inch finishing knife to scrape away ridges left from the first coat. Then spread and smooth another layer of compound over the first. Feather the edges of the patch away from the crack to blend in with the ceiling. You want to keep it as smooth as possible with the knife to reduce later sanding.
When the second coat is dry, use a finishing knife to scrape the rough spots.
For the first two coats, we used a type of mud that dries very hard. For the third coat, we're using a softer type that dries more slowly, but it's a lot easier to sand. There you go.
Thanks. Our ceiling has so many cracks that we're going to cover the whole area with that third layer of mud. This is called a skim coat. You spread it on with a 12-inch finishing knife, and you get it as smooth as you can. It's a good preparation for painting the ceiling since it makes the whole surface uniform.
Once the skim coat's dried, you can sand it lightly, and a pole sander makes that job a lot easier. Use a mesh paper to smooth out the skim coat. It'll produce a lot of dust, so be sure to wear a mask.
After cleaning up all the dust, you can apply a coat of primer paint to get the surface ready for a finishing coat. Painting a ceiling can be a pain in the neck and the arms, so use an extension arm in your rollers to make the job easier. Well, now all we have to do is wait for this coat of paint to dry, and then we'll show you how to enhance this ceiling even further with ceiling beams.
But first, let's take care of the stain in the piano roll.
You're on.
Bringing home the things you need for a do-it-yourself job is easy with one of these tough Chevy S10 pickups. S10 is one of the most popular compact pickups in America.
And one of the hardest working. The standard payload is 1,000 pounds, including cargo, driver, and passengers. Depending on the model, an available payload goes up to 2,000 pounds.
To handle big loads, an S10 cargo box is built tough, like the one in this S10 Maxi Cab. The box sides and tailgate have double wall construction, and because it's all welded, the inside of the box is smooth. You won't find any exposed mounting bolts here to trap water and cause rust.
Inside, with the standard front seat, MaxiCab has room for up to 3 people. But since this is a stretched cab, there's additional room here and back. So with optional rear jump seats and required front buckets, MaxiCab can seat up to 4. And the rear seats fold up for extra cargo space that's also lockable.
This is also a 4-wheel drive model, so InstaTrack is standard. InstaTrack lets you shift from freewheeling 2-wheel drive to 4-wheel drive high and back without stopping at any speed. You shift on the fly through mud, snow, or whatever.
And you do it with fuel-injected engines. S10s are even available with the big 4.3-liter V6, the popular Vortec V6 that delivers 160 horsepower, power that lets an S10 pickup do big jobs like towing. Properly equipped with a Vortec V6 and other required equipment, it can tow up to 3 tons. That includes passengers, trailer, and cargo.
With a big load, you'll like having S10's rear-wheel anti-lock brake system, or ABS for short. It's standard and designed to help you make smooth, stable stops. On 4-wheel drive models, ABS operates only when the truck's in 2-wheel drive. Whether you're a do-it-yourselfer or professional, you'll find a lot of truck for your money in any Chevy S10 pickup. From today's Chevy truck, the heartbeat of America.
A stain like this means that there's a leak above it. Now, the stain isn't too hard to take care of, but you want to stop the leak before you start patching. And cover all the walls and the floors and furniture before you begin your work.
This ceiling is drywall rather than plaster, and as you can see, it's susceptible to damage from upstairs. But fixing it is pretty much the same as it would be if you were fixing a plaster ceiling. First, remove the damaged area, and be ready for a lot of dust and debris as you chip away any loose material. If the ceiling material is solid, you don't have to remove it just because it's stained. There are special paints that will coat stains and prevent them from leaching through your finished coat of paint. But in our case, it looks like a coat of that special paint won't be enough. In fact, the drywall proves to be in pretty bad shape, crumbling away to the wood lath it was attached to.
Uh-oh. What happened?
Yeah, bigger mess than I thought it would be.
I'll say.
Yeah, this ceiling is gone. I just had to remove this whole section here. Plus, there's a part of the ceiling over there we're going to have to tear out.
Well, so now what?
Well, I think the best bet is to patch this thing up, take care of that, and then I think we ought to just cover the whole thing in 3/8" drywall. That's going to look the best.
Oof, that's a lot of work.
It's home remodeling for you.
Well, as you can see, we found a lot more damaged ceiling than we had bargained for. In fact, now our patch is about 100 square feet.
We're installing drywall in this area to shim it up level with the old ceiling. Once that's done, we'll install drywall throughout the entire room. But while the ceiling framing members were still exposed, I marked all the joists for future reference in nailing and screwing down the drywall. Okay, Joel, let's move this thing in place.
Sure. We're using 4x12 sheets of drywall, which can get a little heavy. So we rented this drywall jack to make the job a little easier.
We're using sheets that are 3/8 of an inch thick. That's what they used on the original ceiling, and it should end up level with the rest of the old drywall. We'll be securing the sheets with drywall screws into the joists. This isn't our final layer of drywall, so we're not following the finishing techniques that we'll show you a bit later. But we are putting in enough screws to secure the sheets solidly to the joists. Drywall is a layer of hardened gypsum sandwiched between heavy paper. It's used widely in walls and ceilings today because of its convenience. It's real easy to cut a large sheet like this into the sizes you need. Okay, now that was
First, measure the piece that you need, then mark the length on the drywall. You can use a drywall T-square to make a straight cut. Use a utility knife to score the paper along the cutting line till it breaks through. Then snap the gypsum at the line and cut the paper on the back. You can use the same technique to cut a piece lengthwise as well. The T-square is only 4 feet long, though, so snapping a chalk line is a good way to keep the cut accurate on a long board. If you have to notch a piece of drywall, cut down to the inside corner with a drywall saw. Then score and snap the remaining side.
Earlier, we marked some of the visible ceiling joists. Now we're snapping chalk lines between those to form a grid. This will help us secure the new ceiling to the joists.
The grid looks a little strange on this part of the ceiling. That's because there used to be a porch on this side of the house. So these joists right here run perpendicular to our regular ceiling joists. You got it?
Right there, go ahead.
Ceiling joists are usually set at 16 or 24-inch intervals, so you really only need 2 or 3 to determine the whole ceiling.
One way to check for joists is by tapping on the plaster. If it feels hollow, there's no joist. If it feels solid, you probably found one. You can check by tapping a nail into the plaster and feeling for the joist. When you find one, penetrate nearby in a few places to determine which direction it travels. Don't worry about marring the plaster. You'll be covering it anyway.
After locating 2 or 3, you'll know if they're on 16 or 24-inch centers. Then you can use the tape measure to locate and mark the rest. You need to know each location for properly securing drywall, so do the whole ceiling. And mark the end of each joist on the top of the wall. You'll need that later as a nailing guide.
Go ahead. We're now ready to attach the new drywall directly to the old ceiling.
And we're butting the drywall sheets up against the ceiling molding, so we first cut off the tapered edge on this side. Part of the drywall falls over the new drywall we just put up as shims. It's a good idea to spread adhesive over the new drywall. That gives the ceiling extra strength. It's not necessary over the old ceiling. Then we move the panel into position to screw it in. Notice that we're running the panel perpendicular to the main joist structure in the room. That gives us the most points for securing the drywall to the joists.
All right, Jojo,
you can nail or screw drywall up to the ceiling, but either way, you want the fastener to be dimpled. And that's so the screw or nail head will disappear when you apply joint compound later on.
Using screw guns and drywall screws is the easiest way to attach drywall to a ceiling. The gun has a special feature that produces the proper dimpling on each screw. The idea is to sink the screw head so it's just a bit deeper than the paper, but without breaking the paper.
Try to avoid butting drywall panels end to end as we're forced to do here. Unlike the panel sides, the ends are square and make joints that are difficult to hide. The edges are tapered for smoothing tape and feathering. If you can, use sheets that extend from wall to wall and eliminate end joints altogether. By the way, when you're working with screws, you need to space them 12 inches apart along the joist for proper attachment. That works out to a screw on each edge and 3 in the panel's field.
Our next panel has to accommodate the light fixture. So we measure the distance from the end and from the last sheet, mark a hole for the fixture, and cut it with a keyhole saw.
Tighten it down.
Okay.
When you start your second row, make sure that you don't start it on the same end as you did the first. Otherwise, you'd end up with an obvious seam line all the way across the ceiling. Instead, you want to stagger your seams.
An easy way to do that is to start the second row with a full panel on the same side you ended the first row. Then you can alternate starting points as you move across the room. With those basics in mind, it's just a matter of lifting and securing the rest of the sheets to cover the ceiling.
Well, now the ceiling's covered, but the joints are still exposed. To hide them, you'll need joint compound and reinforcing tape. Earlier, we used fiberglass mesh tape, and now we'll use paper tape to strengthen the joints.
You start by mixing the first layer of compound for taping. It's similar to the compound we use for patching, but this doesn't have the quick-drying catalyst in it. That makes this mud easier to work, and there's less waste. The mud is moist, but you probably want to stir it up a little bit to get the right consistency.
To apply it, use the same techniques we showed you earlier. Start the first layer with a 6-inch taping knife. Fill each seam completely and spread the compound a couple of inches on either side. Tear off a piece of reinforcing tape and push it into the joint compound. And then layer more mud over it.
Make the joint compound as smooth as you can, holding the knife at a 45-degree angle and erasing any bubbles left by the blade. The tape is creased down the middle to help you center it in the seam. As we mentioned earlier, drywall has tapered edges to help make your joint smooth, but the ends aren't tapered, so it takes a little bit more work to make these smooth.
Be sure to cover each of your screw or nail heads as well. Apply the first dab in one direction, then come back across it at a right angle, scraping the mud flush with the surface. Remove all the excess as soon as possible. If it dries, you'll have to sand it off, and you want to keep sanding to a minimum.
We're using mud to fill the gap between the drywall and the molding, and tape to reinforce it.
Using those techniques, you can finish the first application of joint compound on your ceiling drywall. Here's an important tip. Use warm water to keep your blade clean during the work. Any lumps or ridges it picks up will translate to your seams. And don't let your mud sit too long before embedding the tape. It could get tacky. You want to wait until your first layer of joint compound is completely dry before applying the second coat. And the drying time will vary, but it's usually between 12 and 24 hours depending on the temperature and the humidity. Our first layer of joint compound is dry, so we're just about ready to apply the second coat, which is called the fill coat.
But first we'll take some time to smooth out the rough edges on the first coat.
It's the same kind of scraping we did upstairs on the second coat, skimming off the high spots with a 10-inch finishing knife. Don't press hard, you might scratch the drywall surface.
The fill coat here is like the second coat over the cracks upstairs. We spread it out thinly, fill in any gaps, and feather it out about 2 inches past the first coat on either side.
The 6-inch taping knife works just fine for the second coat across the screw and nail heads. Just make sure that you leave a single band across them. This makes sanding easier. The second coat won't take as long to dry, but don't try to rush things, and scrape down the high spots before applying the third and final coat of joint compound.
The third application is called the topping or finish coat. Again, like upstairs, we're using a softer mud so it's easier to sand. You want it spread even wider than the second coat, so you go to a wider finishing knife. This one's 12 inches wide. On this application, you spread the mud another 2 inches beyond each side of the joint second layer. Feather the edges to finish hiding the joints. Some require only 2 coats to cover nail and screw heads, making this finish coat unnecessary.
On drywall, you can apply the third coat as a skim coat, which is what we decided to do. It isn't necessary, but it does make a smoother surface for painting.
Ideally, the mud will dry as smooth as silk and be ready for painting and texturing. But realistically, we're probably going to have to do some sanding like we did in the skim coat upstairs.
Be careful, though. If you sand through the joint compound, it can raise the fuzz of the drywall, so use a light touch.
When you're done, sponge off all the sanding dust. Then check the surface carefully for nicks, scratches, and cuts. Use a thin layer of mud to fill any imperfections, and then smooth that when it's dry.
When the drywall's all smooth and clean, we can start painting the ceiling.
We're ready for the primer coat. And again, we're using extensions to make it a little easier. Don't try to hurry the job by loading the brush or roller with a lot of paint. It'll just drip down the handle anyway, so use a light touch on the paint.
Once this prime coat is dry, we can put on the finishing coat of paint using the same techniques, and that's going to finish this ceiling.
Okay, Joel, 133.5.
Okay. Well, now the paint's dry, and we've removed the plastic covering in our office, but we're not done with this ceiling yet.
We're going to dress it up with some features you may have seen on other ceilings and wondered how they're done.
We're going to add beams across the ceiling with molding in between them, and we're going to paint them all to match the woodwork in here.
They're long, so we're putting them together in the workshop. We're actually making what are known as false beams, using 1x4 boards with 1x3s between them. We first cut them down to the length we need to span our ceiling, minus the depth of the 2 1x4 boards we'll use as the end pieces. We're planning 2 full beams down the middle and 2 half beams on each edge. We also need to cut nailers for each beam.
You could butt the pieces together, but recessing the bottom of the beams will enhance them. It can get tricky, but here's an easy way to do it. First, clamp a spacer to the 1x3 bottom piece and set a combination square on the center of it. Then run a pencil line down the 1x4 side piece. That'll be the nailing guide. Spread a bead of glue down on the edge, and now set the side piece flush with the spacer and nail it in. You can use the spacer to help position the other side. Nail it, and the beam's complete.
We put a first coat of paint on the beams, the end boards, and the uncut molding. It's a lot easier to paint it now than once they're up on the ceiling.
We'll start by securing this 1x4 end board to the wall studs. It runs parallel to the joist and perpendicular to the beams. Okay, hang on here.
Okay.
Can I get jammed in my corner?
Got it there?
Yeah.
All right.
Set.
This one in. We can now secure the nailer that will support the beam. We're running it perpendicular to the ceiling joist and spacing it equally from the edges.
Okay, go ahead.
You want to secure the nailers directly to the joist. You can use either screws or nails, but using screws means less stress on the ceiling.
For the half beams, we screwed a pair of 1x2 nailers along each wall. One screws into the ceiling and the other into the wall.
You got your end there?
Yep, I'm perfect.
Okay, I'm good here, Joe.
Go ahead.
All right.
You nail the half beams at the top into the upper nailer. Then secure the bottom of the beam into the lower piece by nailing from below. And set the nails in so that the next coat of paint covers them. The open ends of the full beams then go over the nailers. And use finishing nails to secure the tops of the beam pieces to the nailer. You got it?
Yep, go ahead.
With the pieces all in, we can cut the molding to fit exactly between the beams.
And by nailing these to the end boards, we give the ceiling a much more finished look. Let's set it down right here.
Well, now our ceiling's completely done. You know, Dean, I'd have to say things are definitely looking up in this room.
Not one of your better puns, Joanne. Well, at any rate, if you're thinking about doing a beam ceiling yourself, remember there's a lot of different ways you can go. Different size boards, different patterns, and different finishes to give you the exact look that you want.
Should we move the rest of the stuff
All
in?
right.
Okay. Well, we hope you've picked up some information on how to fix ceiling problems, how to put up a new drywall ceiling, and how to decorate ceilings with molding and beams.
But we have more to show you on ceilings, and to do that, we're going to take you back to the Project Center.
We'll show you several different ways to dress up a ceiling using tiles and suspended panels.
Homeowners turn to tiles and suspended panels for several reasons. First of all, they're a lot easier to work on than drywall or plaster, and a lot less messy.
And they can make a room a lot less noisy since they absorb about 45% of the sound waves that strike them, which is why they're sometimes called acoustical tiles or panels.
A suspended ceiling can hide a lot of obstructions that would typically mar a ceiling line, like pipes and air ducts.
We'll show you how to put up both tile and suspended panel ceilings and show you a couple of different styles in each category. We'll start with the tiles. Whether you're using tiles or panels, be sure to remove them from their cartons 24 hours before installation to help acclimate them to the room's humidity and temperature.
We build a typical size room here in the Project Center. These ceiling joists represent what you would see if you were doing a ceiling in your basement.
However, you may have a plaster or drywall ceiling, and if that's the case and the ceiling is perfectly level, you can actually glue, nail, or staple the tiles directly to it.
If the ceiling's deteriorated, you'll have to fur it out for the new tile. You can use wood furring strips, then you can nail or staple the tile to those.
Or you could use metal tracks like these. They require a lot less nailing because the tiles just clip on. And the tracks also work on exposed joists as well. And that's the method we're going to use.
If you have a plaster or drywall ceiling, you do need to locate and mark the joist before starting. Do the same as we showed you earlier in the tape, and snap chalk lines along the run of each joist to guide you as you nail. Whether you're using furring strips or metal track, run them perpendicular to the joist so you don't have to add any additional nailing surfaces.
But before you do any nailing, you need to take some measurements to figure out how many tiles and tracks you'll need. And we did that before we picked up our materials.
You first need to know the ceiling's area. Measure the ceiling's length and width, round off to the next largest foot, and multiply the two together. In our case, it's 11 by 15 for a total square footage of 165. That means we need 5 kits and 5 cartons of tiles.
It'd be nice if all ceiling dimensions were in whole numbers and we wouldn't have to cut any tiles and they'd all fit in a perfect pattern.
But unfortunately, not all ceilings are perfect, so we're going to have to do some cutting. But there is a way to do it to still end up with a pleasing pattern.
Well, what you do is cut all the border tiles the same size for each side to balance the remainder. Does that sound complicated?
Yeah, a little bit. But there is an easy way to visualize it. For instance, our end wall measures 10 feet 8 inches, so without adjusting, the border tiles should be 12 inches on one side and 8 inches on the other. Now that's not balanced and not pleasing. To improve it, add the 12 inches to the 8 inches and then divide by 2. Then if you cut each border tile to the resulting 10 inches, it'll balance the whole row.
Use the same formula to balance the ceiling tiles along the side walls. In our case, the resulting dimension is 7 inches. That means the 4 corner tiles would be 10 by 7 inches to balance the end and side walls. It gives the ceiling a professional look. You need to know the width of the end wall border tiles when you go to install your second row of track, so do all your figuring beforehand.
Here you go. The first section of track goes in 1 inch from the sidewall, and a chalk line can help you make certain you have a nice straight line.
Okay, hang on. Not quite there.
Okay, right about there.
The track for this system comes in 4-foot sections. You can secure them to the joist with the nails provided in the kits, or you can use a screw gun and drywall screws. Just make sure that each section is secured with at least 2 nails or screws, and make sure that the sections are level. If they're not, shim under the tracks to make them level.
When you install the second section, keep it in line with the first, since you might have to install a clip over the joint. In fact, you can leave up to a 1/4 inch gap between them. Okay.
At the end, you could cut a section of track to fit, but you can also install another full section of track a 1/2 inch outside of the rest of the track, and that's really easier.
It's important to stagger the track joints between the rows. To do this, we'll start the second row on this end and then alternate our starting point the rest of the way.
To figure out how far over you need to go for that second row, subtract 2 inches from the figure you got for the width of the border tile. So for us, that's 8 inches.
Using that figure assures you of a second firm surface to anchor the border tiles. The rest of the second track goes on like the first.
The other tracks go up 12 inches apart, so now's a good time to mark those points on the end wall and snap your chalk lines.
You want it?
Go ahead.
That takes you to the final track. Like the first, you want it to lay in 1 inch from the wall. You'll anchor the final row of tiles on that track.
With the marks on, you can install the rest of the tracks. Remember to alternate the ends your 4-foot sections start on. That'll stagger the seams between the tracks. Well, that looks pretty good.
Right, let me check this down here.
Once all the tracks are up, you can double check with the level for any dips or rises in the tracks. And if you see any problem areas, you can just shim them. Well, now we're ready for the tiles. Now before starting, you might want to wash your hands because you want to keep the tiles clean. These are mineral fiber tiles, and you'll notice that there are extensions along the edges. The 2 shorter extensions are called the tongues, and these longer ones are called the flanges.
The tile installation begins in the corner, and we work our way across the room. Now the beginning is crucial, and the first step is to cut one of the border dimensions into the corner tile. First, measure a tile for the sidewall border dimension. In our case, it's 10 inches. Mark the tile on the face, measuring in from the side flange. You want to cut away the tongue side to fit flush against the wall. It's easy to cut a tile using a utility knife and a straight edge. Score it 3 times on the line, going deeper each time. Then it should snap apart easily when you press it.
Now you need to cut the other border dimension for the tile. But if you go by the figures, it might not fit snugly. That's because the corners in rooms are rarely perfectly square. But with a string as a guide, you can overcome that problem.
First, measure out from the end wall the length you determined for your sidewall border tiles. Our length is 7 inches. Then tack the string in place parallel to the end wall about a ½ inch below the tracks. Now set the corner tile you cut against the side wall. Measure from the string to the end wall down each side of the tile. We first mark our dimensions on the tile, and then we score in between our marks. And then it should just snap. And if your room isn't square, this technique should make up any differences.
You can test the cuts by putting the piece in the corner. The edge should line up with the string, and it does. Then you can install it. Snap a clip on the first 2 tracks with the teeth facing out and slide them against the wall. Now line up the tile with the side edge and push it against the clips. Make sure the teeth dig into the tile. Snap 2 more clips onto the tracks and push them into the tile. And that secures it to the tracks.
Now you can cut the second tile. Hold a full tile in place against the end wall with the tongue in the first tile's flange and the flanges facing out. Then measure again along each side from the string to the end wall.
7 5/16.
Transfer those lengths to a tile and score it. Here you go, Jojo.
Thanks, Dean.
Snap a clip on the third track against the wall. Then push the second tile into place against the clip and secure it with another clip. Make sure the end of this tile lines up with the string as well.
Now here's a trick for measuring the side edge of the third tile, which will be placed against here. First of all, line it up with the second tile you installed. Make sure your edges are flush. And then just temporarily clip it in place. Now from the side wall, measure over 12 inches and mark it on the tile's front and back. Take the tile down and cut it along a line between the marks. Now, slide the tile into place and secure it with clips. Its edge should line up with the first tile. Now, if everything's cut right, this fourth tile should fit in perfectly without having to be cut. Voila!
If the edges of the first 4 tiles don't line up perfectly, you have to do them over again. Here you go, Joe.
Thanks.
Because the alignment of the rest of the ceiling depends on that first corner. Once that's up, you're on your way. Continue down along the end wall, measuring for each border tile as we showed you, then cutting and clipping it in place. When you get to the end, you'll need another corner tile. This time, cut the side wall length an extra 1/4 inch short to allow for expansion. Then measure and cut the other side to fit along the string, and clip the tile in place.
Now go back to your first corner and start filling the ceiling diagonally. It goes pretty fast through the middle since you don't have to cut any tiles. And you just need 1 clip on each full tile to hold it on the track. When you get to the other end, then you'll need to do the border tiles a bit differently. You want the last row of tiles to fit as close to the wall as possible, but that doesn't leave you a whole lot of room to clip them in. All you have to do is just cut the end wall side of the tile a ½ inch short. But before putting the tile up, put the clip on flush against the wall. Then slip the tile into position and use a screwdriver to dig the teeth of the clip into the tile. That extra ½ inch gives you the room you need to work. You can use the same technique to install the rest of the last row.
And don't worry about the gap that leaves, because you can cover those and add an attractive feature to the ceiling with molding. It comes in several styles and nails up easily into the wall studs. If you paint or stain the molding, be sure to do it before you put the molding up.
Well, that finishes the ceiling tile installation. These mineral fiber tiles are washable if they get dirty, they're fire retardant, and they're paintable if you want a different color.
There are several styles available that you can install with the same system. We're going to show you another type. So let's take a moment to put up that ceiling.
Up here, we have a different style of the same type of mineral fiber tile. You can see it gives the room a different look and a different texture.
Like the other tiles, they reflect a lot of light, between 60 to 80%. Now we want to take you in a different direction, but still maintain the same installation.
Well, for instance, if you like the look of wood, the wood finish on this plank might be of interest. It's also made out of mineral fiber and it goes up on the same tracks as our tiles.
The planks come in 3 different widths to give the ceiling a rounded look. For our first row, we'll use the widest one. Here you go, Joel.
Thanks.
Up over your head.
Yeah. One way or another, we'll get it.
Okay. You want the edge flush against the wall, so set up a string 7.5 inches from your starting wall to serve as a guide. Hold up the plank and measure from the string to the wall along each end to determine the points for cutting. Transfer those to the face of the plank and cut it the same way you cut the ceiling tiles. Notice that the planks also have tongues and flanges like the tiles. To keep the plank tight to the sidewall, remove the tongue before putting it up.
You can attach the wall clips now on every other track, starting with the first track. Set the first plank into the teeth of the first 3 clips and make sure it's lined up with the string guide. Then anchor it with clips on the second and fourth tracks. Continue down the row with the widest planks, cutting them to line up under the string and clipping them in on every other track. You'll probably have to cut a plank to fit in the end. Use narrower planks when you start the second row, and start the row on the same end where you just finished. This will stagger the seams.
Clips for the second row go on the second and fourth tracks, and make sure that you're alternating the tracks that you clip on from row to row. Use a third width of planks on the third row, staggering the seams with the second row. Then keep working with that pattern across the ceiling, using remainders of cut planks where possible to start rows and keep seams staggered. When you finish, cover the gaps with molding, as we showed you in the ceiling tile installation.
Well, this should give you a good sense of what a wood grain plank ceiling looks like. You can also cement the planks directly to an existing ceiling or attach them to wood furring strips, but they can't be secured directly to exposed wood joists.
We're now ready for the suspended ceiling. The 2x4 panels are made of mineral fiber, and the most popular styles resemble textured plaster ceilings.
What distinguishes the panel system is the suspended grid that supports the panels. It's a series of molding sections, cross tees, and main runners hung from wires that hook to the ceiling.
The grid can hang as low as you like, but for most panels, you need at least 3 inches clearance from the old ceiling, 6 inches if you're planting lights.
The instructions come with a sheet that help you plot your grid. Now remember, you need to take into account the dimensions of the room and the location and the direction of the joist. Then use a variation of the formula we showed you earlier to create a balanced pattern. Divide the length of the short wall by 4, the length of the panel. Add 4 to the remainder and divide the result by 2. That's the length of the 2 side wall border panels. In our case, 3 feet, 4 inches.
Then divide the length of the long wall by 2, the width of the panels. Add 2 to the remainder and divide the result by 2. That's the width of the end wall border panels. For us, 1 foot 2 inches.
Now lay out the grid with the main runners perpendicular to the joists. They're 4 feet from each other and the length of the border panels from the side walls. The cross tees are perpendicular to the main runners, 2 feet from each other, and the width of the border tiles from the short wall. This is the type of lighting fixture that's used with suspended ceiling panels. If you're planning these, figure on using one for about every 75 square feet of ceiling area and add that to your ceiling layout.
With your layout done then, you can determine how many panels, main runners, and cross tees you'll need. And you can calculate how much wall molding it'll take to mount the grid. The wall molding comes in 10-foot sections. Divide the perimeter of the room by 10 to figure out how many of these you want. Then you're all set to put up the grid.
First, measure down from the joist or existing ceiling for the height of the new grid. We're going down 6 inches.
Okay, Jojo.
Then draw a level line on the wall all the way around the room. You can save a step on the fourth wall by snapping a chalk line between the side walls.
Place the molding under the line so you don't see the line when you're done. Then nail the molding to the wall, going through the studs. Use a metal snips to cut and fit the molding to the corner. You don't need a fancy cut for the next piece. Just butt the pieces at an inside corner and continue. Use miter cuts only for an outside corner.
Next, you mark the positions of your main runners at both ends of the room. Follow your grid layout to get this just right. Then snap a chalk line for each runner. Yeah, right about there. The main runners hang from screw eyelets and wires, and you put them into the joist about every 4 feet or so along the chalk lines you just snapped.
Use 16 gauge wire for your grid. Cut 6 inches longer than the length of your ceiling suspension. And then twist each wire 3 times for a good secure hold. You need a set of reference strings to guide you now. This one is set out to the width of the border panels, and it's secured just under the molding.
You also need reference strings laid out along the lengths of the main runners. Make sure they intersect the first string at 90-degree angles.
We want a cross tee to fit into a slot on the main runner where these 2 strings meet. To do that, we'll measure from here to the wall. All right, Joe, 14 3/8.
Got it. Now you measure back from a cross tee slot about that distance down on your runner. It'd be right there. And that's going to be where you make your cut.
For the next step, rest the runner on the molding. At the other end, find the wire support hole closest to the last hanger wire over the runner. Mark it for reference. Put the runner in place along each of the side walls and mark where the support hole hits the wall. Drive nails at the marks and string a reference line between them.
This new string indicates where to bend the wire to hang the main runner and keep it at the right height. Where the string and the wire intersect, you want to bend the wire at a right angle with square-nosed pliers. There we go.
Once it's positioned on both ends, it's hanging at the right height, so just bend the wires at the support holes. Then twist the wires at least 3 times for a firm hold. And make sure the runner stays in line with the reference string below it.
You can cut a piece of runner to fit to the end. It locks into the previous piece and rests on the molding. And you want a hanging wire to be as close to the joint as possible for extra strength.
To start the next row, you can use a full piece of main runner or the remainder of the piece you just cut. Just make sure that the cross tee slot falls right over the first reference string. Then the rest of the row goes the same as the first.
Our next step is to install these 4-foot cross tee sections every 2 feet along the main runners. And the ends just slip right into the cross tee slots.
Then we can install our full 2x4 panels. They help stabilize the grid before we put up our border cross tees and panels. And they're easy to slip in. All we need is 3 inches of clearance for easy maneuvering.
There, you got it. We're not using a light panel in our final grid, but if you are, here's how it goes in. It fits right into a 2x4 section, but just make sure that you anchor it separately to the joist with wires at each of the 4 corners. Well, let's hoist it out.
To finish the grid, we need to measure and cut for the border cross tees individually to make up for any irregularities in the wall. And here's a quick way to do that. Hold the cross tee upside down and backwards, lining the flat edge at the end against the molding. Make sure the main runner is lined up with the reference string. Then use the snips to cut the other end at the middle of the main runner. That gives you exactly the right length. Using that technique, you can finish the grid. For stability, alternate from right to left as you put in the cross tees.
Your border panels will have to be measured and cut to fit the remaining spaces. And be sure to measure the panel from each side to account for walls and corners that aren't square. Cutting the panels is like cutting tiles. After measuring, use a cross tee as a straight edge to score a cutting line with a utility knife. Then you just snap off the excess, and then you're ready to scan your cut panels and finish the ceiling.
So those are the basics for installing a suspended ceiling. Now you may run into problems that seem like real stumpers. So let's take a look at some of the solutions.
Suspended ceilings hide many obstructions like air ducts or pipes, but problems arise when obstructions hang down too low. Here's a solution. Nail 1x2 strips on either side of the obstruction. Build a pair of lattices to cover each side of the obstruction and nail them into the strips. Nail 1x2 strips between the two lattices to frame in the obstruction. Then cover the frame with a finishing material and add molding at the corners. Then mark the new ceiling height on the sides, nail up ceiling molding, and incorporate it in your grid.
Maybe you have a basement window framed in flush with a joist. A suspended ceiling would interfere with its operation. The solution is a 3-sided valance with a plywood backing. Make it 18 inches longer than the window to allow for drapery, and wide enough for the window to clear. Then nail it to the joist and use the sides to anchor the ceiling molding. You can also cut holes in panels to accommodate small lights or vents. And if you encounter a vertical pipe, there's a neat trick you can do to make it look seamless with some types of panels. Mark the midpoint of the hole on the back of the panel. Score it once, and snap it there. This is the only time you'll cut from the back. Then put the panel back together around it. The cutting seam will virtually disappear. Now you can cut the hole in on the edge of each piece.
What we have on the ceiling now is a basic style of 2x4 panel, but there are different styles. Let's take a look.
This set of ceiling panels is designed to hide the metal grid. It's also made of mineral fiber, and it installs the same as the first set.
This third paneling style also features the grid hiding design, and the 2x4 panels also incorporate a design that resembles a ceiling tile motif.
This is a specialized type of paneling that's also available. It's 3 inches of fiberglass and it insulates the ceiling. It has an R value of 12.
But sometimes you don't always have the clearance for a regular 2x4 panel. And if that's the case, this thinner type could work. It's flexible and it could cut your clearance to a couple of inches.
Now we want to show you some styles available in 2x2 ceiling panels. They produce a different look than 2x4 ceilings. And to enhance the effect, we've replaced the white grid with black.
We began installation just as we did for the 2x4 panel grid, with the main runners and the 4-foot cross tees in the same positions.
To change our 2x4 sections to 2x2, we just snap in these 2-foot cross tees between the 4-foot cross tees.
You can now put in the 2x2 panels to stabilize the grid. They're mineral fiber panels and they're called tegular. And that means that the surface is slightly raised, which essentially recesses the grid.
To finish the grid, we cut down the 2-foot pieces to fit into the border sections. And this is the same technique we showed you earlier for the cross tees.
You need to cut the panels to fit the border sections. And the first step is the same as we showed you earlier. But you need to take one extra step to duplicate the tegular surface. After cutting the panel to the size you need, put it in place on the grid. Mark where the edges of the grid hit the panel surface and remove it. Cut along the line, but only halfway through the panel. Then use the edge of a full panel as a guide and score a line the right height along the edge. Then cut through along that line and remove the strip. gives this border panel the same edge as the full panels, and it maintains our recessed grid pattern. This is one of the many colors and styles available in 2x2 panels. Let's take a quick look at a couple of others.
Here's a type of panel that gives you the feeling of a woven fabric. Now back to white and a different texture in 2x2 panels.
Well, that should give you a good idea of the different looks you can get overhead with 2x2 ceiling panels.
And with the other types of ceilings we've shown you, you can see there's a wide variety of choices to brighten your ceilings with tiles or panels.
And don't forget, there are lots of ways to repair cracked or stained ceilings. So good luck with your ceiling projects. I'm Joanne Liebler.
And I'm Dean Johnson.
Home Time is made possible by Chevy Truck, who brings you tough, full-size Chevy pickups for professionals and do-it-yourselfers like you. Chevy S10 pickups, compact, fun, and hard-working. Chevy S10 Blazer, logic and laughter in 2- or 4-wheel drive. Chevy Astro, the van that can. The heartbeat of America. Today's Chevy Truck.
Before you start a major home project on your own, getting a tough new Chevy truck to help out is a smart thing to do. The best way to check out the model that interests you is to take a test drive at your local Chevy dealer. And here's a tip on how to buy your new Chevy truck and get the options you want, while saving some money too. Ask your dealer about preferred equipment groups of options. There are special packages of options most truck buyers want, and usually order individually. Options that can include popular items such as air conditioning and automatic transmission. When you buy them as part of a preferred equipment group, you can save a lot. You'll get them at savings based on manufacturer's suggested retail prices compared to the same options purchased separately. It's more economical for Chevy to offer you options as a package or group. Chevy saves and passes the savings on to you. You'll enjoy the options while you own your Chevy truck, and they can add to its resale or trade-in value. So any way you look at it, preferred equipment groups of options are a good idea, and they're available on all new Chevy full-size pickups, S10 pickups, and S10 Blazers. Your Chevy dealer has all the latest details. Preferred equipment groups of options are another money-saving idea from today's Chevy truck, the heartbeat of America.